Right, so we begin our class, and today we begin with the second sermon. In the last class, we saw that there was an allusion to Noah's flood with the rain falling on the chapel. After that, the second sermon is also on hell. So even though the sermons are supposed to be on the four last things, that is death, judgment, heaven and hell, we find that most of the sermons deal with hell. Because the basic purpose of the priest is to induce a fear in the minds of the young boys about sin and the consequences that one must suffer in hell. So the priest begins by saying the story of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, my dear boys, were, as you know, our first parents, and you will remember that they were created by God in order that the seats in heaven left vacant by the fall of Lucifer and his rebellious angels might be filled again. The story ultimately is the story about Lucifer, and Lucifer has a very important significance in this novel. Lucifer, we are told, was a son of the morning, a radiant and mighty angel, yet he fell. He fell, and there fell with him a third part of the host of heaven. He fell and was hurled with his rebellious angels into hell. What his sin was we cannot say. Theologians consider that it was the sin of pride, the sinful thought conceived in an instant, non serviam, I will not serve. That instant was his ruin. He offended the majesty of God by the sinful thought of one instant, and God cast him out of heaven into hell forever. So why is Lucifer important in this novel? Because later in the novel, Stephen says the same thing, the quotation from the Bible, non serviam, which was said by Lucifer, that is Satan, before his fall. Non serviam means I will not serve. And later in the novel, when his mother wants Stephen to serve Easter duty, then Stephen refuses to do it. So he had taken this position of non serviam, that is I will not serve. And why? Because as an artist, he asserted his independence. So an artist is not, according to this theory which is proposed in this novel, the aesthetic theory of art, or the expressionist theory of art, or the art for art's sake theory. So according to this theory, the artist does not serve any body or any institution or any individual. An artist creates because he cannot do otherwise. Basically, he creates for his own satisfaction, and the fact that other people take satisfaction in his work, or that the work comes to possess some great aesthetic value, that is kind of accidental. So the notion here in this art for art's sake theory is that art does not serve any ulterior purpose. So this art for art's sake theory, which kind of developed from the poetic movements led by Baudelaire in France, and taken up with zeal by Oscar Wilde and others in England. In France it was called l'art pour l'art, that is art for art's sake. This was a reaction to the kind of utilitarianism that was prevalent mostly in England after the Industrial Revolution, with the contributions by philosophers like Locke and Hume and Bergson, more and more emphasis was on morality and utility. And the Art for Art's sake was a reaction against all these philosophical thoughts, where the artist pronounced his independence from any ulterior purpose of art. So here we see that Lucifer, who was a rebel figure in heaven, this figure merges in Stephen's psyche with the figure of the artist. So in a sense, an artist is also a rebel figure. He refuses to serve any particular cause or any particular movement or any particular purpose. So the allusion here to Lucifer, the brightest angel in heaven, and the brightest angel and all his supporters, when they fell, then 1/3 of heaven's population was depleted. And here the priest says that God's purpose in creating man was to repopulate heaven. But unfortunately or fortunately that did not happen. So we did not become citizens of heaven, but we are citizens of earth. So in one sense, this novel is a repudiation of the Christian morality or the Christian proposition that man should serve the dictates of religion. The priest goes on to talk about the fall of man. So after the fall of Lucifer and his followers, God thought that he would repopulate heaven with man, but unfortunately man also fell, and by the device of Satan, man fell. So it seems that fall is a part of the game, that fall is an essential paradigm, and the paradigm in this novel reaches back to the image of Daedalus and his son Icarus. The Daedalus story is, it also tells us about Icarus, and we know that Icarus did not listen to his father's advice not to go too close to the sun, and he soared high above, and as a result the wax melted and his wings fell, and he fell into the sea. So the fall of Icarus is a kind of theme which has been represented by many artists. So here Joyce uses that notion, very impressive use of the myth of the fall of Icarus, that somewhere somebody who was flying high in sky like a meteor fell into the sea, and the world remained oblivious to that fall. The flight of Daedalus and Icarus is a great event, because it indicates the ambition of man to break the barriers, that is the barriers put upon him by nature, that man cannot normally fly. So this is symbolical of man's soaring ambition, and in this respect man is much closer to Satan than to angels. So the priest goes on talking about the Blessed Virgin Mary and how man did not listen to the advice of the angels, and goes on to talk about the punishment that man receives in hell, like darkness in hell, the fire in hell, and the stench in hell, all in a very great detail. the purpose is obviously to create a great impression on the young minds of the boys. So you see here on page 112 in my edition, our earthly fire, again, no matter how fierce or widespread it may be, is always of a limited extent, but the lake of fire in hell is boundless, shoreless and bottomless. So this detailed discussion of fire in hell and so on, that reminds us of Milton. And you remember that in Book 1 of Paradise Lost, Milton derives from Saint Basil the idea that the fire in hell burns one but does not emit any light, so that there is overall darkness. And then after 2 pages, again a repetition of this sentence from the Gospel of St. Matthew's. Depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire which was prepared for the devil and his angels. Reminding the audience about the punishment that they would experience if they commit sin. The result, when the sermon stopped, Stephen's brain was overwhelmed by the idea of hell, and his brain was simmering and bubbling within the cracking tenement of the skull. Flames burst forth from his skull like a corolla, shrieking like voices. Corolla, I suppose, should be or perhaps means corona, like the flame which leaps out from the sun. Shrieking like voices, hell, 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 hell. Voices spoke near him. On hell. I suppose he rubbed it into you well. So this is a dialogue among the students, among Stephen's friends. You bet he did. He put us all into a blue funk. That's what you fellows want, and plenty of it to make you work. So the boys say that Stephen, they also noticed that Stephen was very much overpowered or overwhelmed by the sermon. And then Stephen thinks that these voices in his mind that speak about hell, they kind of keep tormenting him. So when other boys were munching their lunch tranquilly, Stephen was thinking of it. There was still time, O Mary, refuge of sinners, intercede for him. O Virgin undefiled, save him from the gulf of death. So he was thinking whether he would be saved or not if he asked for an intercession by Virgin Mary. Then the English lesson begins with the hearing of the history, but Stephen continuously thinks about his spiritual crisis. His soul sank back deeper into depths of contrite peace, no longer able to suffer the pain of dread, and sending forth as he sang a faint prayer. Ah yes, he would still be spared, he would repent in his heart and be forgiven. And then those above, those in heaven, would see what he would do to make up for the past. A whole life, every hour of life, only wait. This chapter is again like the previous chapters, has this pattern that a crisis develops and the crisis is resolved towards the end. In the earlier chapter, the crisis was about the extreme desire, the sensual desire that Stephen felt, and Stephen tried to solve that crisis by going to the prostitutes. In this chapter we see an opposite movement sets in him. He feels regretful, remorseful for his sins, so-called sins, and he wants to repent and wants to become the ideal religious person, and becomes more and more spiritual in this chapter. And finally he goes to confess to a distant chapel, distant from his school, and there he confesses to the father all confessions are anonymous, and he confesses his sins, and then there is a kind of solution to the crisis. And we have to remember that that confession again is a part of the central motive of apology or confession that runs throughout this. So the next evening again, the third sermon begins. This evening we shall consider for a few moments the nature of the spiritual torments of hell. So you see that every sermon is mostly about hell and the torment, the physical torment, the spiritual torments, the mental crisis, and so on. So the priest wants to rub in the minds of the students very thoroughly all the sufferings that might ensue if one commits sin. And the priest speaks elaborately on the different kind of pains that one suffers in hell. Then the conscience is there to provide further punishment to the sinner, and the priest talks about the threefold sting of conscience, the viper which gnaws the very heart's core of the wretches in hell, so that filled with hellish fury they curse themselves for their folly and curse the evil companions who have brought them to such ruin, and curse the devils who tempted them in life and now mock them and torture them in eternity, and even revile and curse the Supreme Being, whose goodness and patience they scorned and slighted, but whose justice and power they cannot evade. So we may imagine that in or through these sermons, Joyce makes use not only of the earlier pictures of hell given by Dante and Milton, but he also makes use of these early descriptions of hell in a very creative way, and by no means such long discourses on hell would have been possible in a novel, because a modern novel particularly should have a very tight plot, and long discourses on anything is almost impossible, cannot be conceived. But Joyce does that impossible thing in this novel and presents us with these 4 long sermons, pages after pages, but there is no action, no real progress in the action of the novel, apart from the development in Stephen's psyche, his mind. And anybody who is familiar with sermon literature would notice how Joyce in these sermons gives us an exact example of how the Roman Catholic sermons were written, and the Jesuits, how they wrote their sermons, by developing different points. So there would be a logical development, a point-by-point development of the different arguments about the particular theme in hand, or the particular line from the Bible which has been selected for the sermon. Like the second sermon began, with which we began today, by taking the text from the book of Isaiah, 5th chapter, 14th verse. Hell has enlarged its soul and opened its mouth without any limits. So every sermon is supposed to select a particular text from the Bible and to elaborate it, to interpret it, to develop it, and thus the sermon develops by explicating particular words in the text and gradually developing an argument. So in that also Joyce is very faithful to the tradition of sermon writing. But what is significant is that the priest describes sin as the production of an instant. So one instant you make or you think something sinful or take a wrong decision, an immoral decision, and then you commit sin. A sin, an instant of rebellious pride of the intellect, made Lucifer and a third part of the cohorts of angels fall from their glory. A sin, an instant of folly and weakness, drove Adam and Eve out of Eden and brought death and suffering into the world. And then, as the sermon ends, the priest wants all the boys to recite the act of contrition, that is, lines where sort of, people sort of apologize to God for committing sins. Oh my God, I am heartily sorry for having offended thee, and I detest my sins above every other evil, because they displease thee, my God, who art so deserving of all my love, and I firmly purpose by thy holy grace never more to offend thee and to amend my life. So this act of contrition, it is like a formulaic, a ritual pronunciation, which the priest pronounces and all other members of the audience, they pronounce it all together. So the purpose of this is to imprint upon the mind of the audience by loudly pronouncing this kind of apology. And then Stephen, being deeply impressed or influenced by the sermons, keeps thinking, could it be that he, Stephen Dedalus, had done those things? His conscience sighed in answer. Yes, he had done them, secretly, filthily, time after time, and hardened in sinful impenitence. He had dared to wear the mask of holiness before the tabernacle itself, while his soul was a living mass of corruption. How came it that God had not struck him dead? The leprous company of his sins closed above him, breathing upon him, bending over him from all sides. He strove to forget them in an act of prayer, huddling his limbs closer together and binding down his eyelids. But the senses of his soul would not be bound, and though his eyes were shut fast, he saw the places where he had sinned, and though his ears were tightly covered, he heard. So Stephen falls asleep, and he actually has a dream. But Joyce, of course, does not tell the reader that he falls asleep or that he has a dream, but we have to understand it. So he, in his sleep, thinks about how he abused all his senses by seeing filthy things or enjoying filthy pleasure. He desired with all his will not to hear or see. He desired till his frame shook under the strain of his desire, and until the senses of his soul closed. They closed for an instant and then opened. He saw. So the attempt to withdraw from the senses, that is, not to hear anything, not to see anything, to withdraw into oneself so that the senses cannot commit sin, that attempt is futile, because then he sees. He opens his eyes, but he opens his eyes in his dream, and in his dream he sees what? A field of stiff weeds and thistles and tufted nettle bunches. Thick among the tufts of rank stiff growth lay battered canisters and clots and coils of solid excrement. A faint marsh light struggled upwards from all the ordure through the bristling grey grass weeds. So the reference to excrement, reference to the bad smell, ordure, and the filth. Ordure means filth. An evil smell, faint and foul as the light, curled upwards sluggishly out of the canisters and from the stale crusted dung. So this is scatological imagery. Imagery of filth, shit, urine. These are called scatological imagery. The French novelist Rabelais is a great user of scatological imagery. Undoubtedly Joyce learnt a lot from him. But you have to remember that up to the 19th century Romantic movement, beginning from the ancient classical times, Greek and Roman times, up to the 19th century Romantic movement, things which are filthy, which are not beautiful, they were kind of not allowed to enter into the domain of literature. So the exception, for example, we cannot name many exceptions apart from some writers of satirists, or a writer like Rabelais, or the Lucianic satires, we may say. Otherwise, basically in the poetic tradition, filth, ugliness, evil, these were not allowed to enter in literature. So Joyce was breaking this tradition, the mainstream tradition, and introducing elements which were found earlier only in some exceptional kind of literature. And then comes the dream of the fallen angels, who seem to metamorphose into reptilian creatures. So we may call it a vision in a dream. Now this is also a very ancient literary tradition, and in the Latin tradition there is even a rhetorical figure called visio, visio, and this was used by Chaucer, by a great number of poets and writers earlier. Creatures were in the field, 1, 3, 6. Creatures were moving in the field hither and thither, goatish creatures with human faces, horny browed, lightly bearded and grey as India rubber. So goat, traditionally a goat stands for lust, extreme lust, and the beard and the horns, horny browed, horns are the horns of a devil. So these are all characteristics taken from what traditionally was considered as evil or devilish. The malice of evil glittered in their hard eyes as they moved hither and thither, trailing their long tails behind them. So the tails or the reptilian features, they are also indicative of the downgrading or degrading of the features. So from being in the highest reaches of the chain of being, the angels who were just after God, they fall and they are degraded to reptilian creatures with long tails. So these tails and the reptilian features, they suggest their fall, their moral degradation or spiritual degradation. A rictus of cruel malignity lit up greyly their old bony faces. One was clasping about his ribs a torn flannel waistcoat. Another complained monotonously as his beard stuck in the tufted weeds. Soft language issued from their spittleless lips as they swished in slow circles round and round the field, winding hither and thither through the weeds, dragging their long tails amid the rattling canisters. So the sentence itself is a very long sentence, which almost reminds us of a Miltonic period, and I told you that the beard was a sign of evil in earlier times. In the Renaissance, we know that the witches, they were always described as having beard. So the beard could be a representation of male superiority, male power, but also the beard was associated with evil. So these creatures, they have a beard, and the sentence has a number of soft sounds like S, L, and you see, soft language, spittleless lips, swished slow circles. So the accumulation of this S sound and combination of S and L creates a kind of a whispering effect, and this is the kind of sound that comes out from these creatures, And this whisper always stands for something evil. As we remember that Satan softly whispered into the ears of Eve when he tempted Eve to eat the fruit. Soft language issued from them, okay, from their spitless lips, and they go round and round. They move in a round circles, dragging their long tails. They moved in slow circles, circling closer and closer to enclose to enclose. So as if they were, kind of imprisoning him, and he was feeling suffocated as they were moving closer and closer to him. Soft language issuing from their lips, their long swishing tails besmeared with stale shrieked, thrusting upwards their terrific faces. Help! He flung the blankets from him madly to free his face and neck. So now you know that he was sleeping and having a dream, because he flings his blanket from him. That was his hell. God had allowed him to see the hell reserved for his sins, stinking, bestial, malignant, a hell of lecherous, goatish fiends for him. So as if God sends all these evil creatures for him to punish him. Now this dream, this vision, and the reptilian creatures which are imagined by Stephen here, they bear a great resemblance to a famous painting by a Renaissance artist, Peter Bruegel, on the theme of the fall of the rebel angels. And in that painting, Bruegel depicts the angels metamorphosing into reptilian creatures and insects. So I'll show you the painting, which is fortunately on the cover of the Fowler edition of Milton. So here you see a representation. You may not be able to see very well because my camera is not so good, but here you can see that the angels, they are being metamorphosed into reptilian creatures and insects. If you cannot see it well here, you can always look at the painting on the internet. It is by Peter Bruegel, P-I-E-T-E-R, Bruegel, The Fall of the Rebel Angels. Then, after one or two pages, the whisper ceased, and he knew then clearly that his own soul had sinned in thought and word and deed, willfully through his own body. Confess, he had to confess every sin. How could he utter in words to the priest what he had done? Must. Or how could he explain without dying of shame? Or how could he have done such things without shame? A madman, a loathsome madman, confess. Oh, he would indeed to be free and sinless again. Perhaps the priest would know, oh dear God. So he comes to the conclusion that in order to free his soul, he must confess to a priest. So he must go for a confession, even though he found it very difficult to utter things which he had done. Then we come to the confession, which will be a resolution to this crisis for Stephen. So he comes to a chapel, a church, which is distant from his school, because he does not want anybody familiar to be there in the church and see him confessing. And confessions are always anonymous because the confessor sits before the latticed window, and on the other side of the latticed window is the priest, so they cannot see each other. They can only hear each other. So first he repeats the Confiteor, the Latin chant for confession, which we found at the early stages of the novel also. We found that in the chapter where Stephen is bullied by Heron, confess, and he forces him to pronounce the Confiteor, or Stephen pronounces the Confiteor. So that was there in manner of a joke, but here in earnest Stephen pronounces the Confiteor. How long is it since your last confession, my child? So the priest asks and Stephen replies to his questions. A long time, father. So not confessing regularly is also considered evil. So Stephen did not confess for a very long time. A month, my child, longer, father. 3 months, my child, longer, father. 6 months, 8 months, father. He had begun. The priest asked. So what did he begin? He began talking about his sins. So the first sin was that he did not confess for 8 months. And what do you remember since that time? He began to confess his sins. Masses missed, prayers not said, lies. So these are like very ordinary sins, not going to the mass or not saying his prayer. Anything else, my child? Sins of anger, envy of others, gluttony, vanity, disobedience. So Stephen says almost everything that is in the book, everything that is considered a sin, Stephen seems to have done all that. Anything else, my child? Sloth. So these are, these belong to the cardinal sins, the 6 cardinal sins. Anger, sloth, envy, gluttony, and so on. Anything else, my child? There was no help, he murmured. I committed sins of impurity, father. The priest did not turn his head. So he uses some kind of a, roundabout ways to conceal the exact things that he did. With yourself, my child? So very phrases, we may say, talking in a roundabout manner. And with others? So Stephen says that with yourself, my child, and Stephen answers, and with others. So both with himself and with others. So confessing that he did something with himself, that is masturbation, and with others, that is committing sex with others also. With women, my child? Yes, father. Were they married women, my child? He did not know. His sins trickled from his lips one by one, trickled in shameful drops from his soul, festering and oozing like a sore, a squalid stream of vice. The last sins oozed forth, sluggish, filthy. There was no more to tell. So you see, Stephen imagines the sins to be something that can be perceived with the senses. So the sense of touch, the sense of movement, so liquid oozing forth like something, some pus coming out of a boil. So a sensuous imagination of something which is abstract. The priest was silent. Then he asked, how old are you, my child? 16, father. The priest passed his hand several times over his face. Then resting his forehead against his hand, he leaned towards the grating and with eyes still averted spoke slowly. His voice was weary and old. You are very young, my child, he said, and let me implore of you to give up that sin. It is a terrible sin. It kills the body and kills the soul. It is the cause of many crimes and misfortunes. Give it up, my child, for God's sake. It is dishonorable and unmanly. You cannot know where that wretched habit will lead you or where it will come against you. As long as you commit that sin, my poor child, you will never be worth one farthing to God. Pray to our Mother Mary to help you. She will help you, my child. Pray to our Blessed Lady when that sin comes into your mind. I am sure you will do that. Will you not? So the Roman Catholics, they always ask for the intercession of Virgin Mary. So Mary to the Roman Catholics is someone who is in between man and Christ, or man and God. On the other hand, the Protestants do not believe in any intercession between man and God. So man must face God personally, directly. in Protestant theology. And the Protestants believe the worship of Mary to be idolatry, idol worship, which they consider to be sinful. Now the cult of Mary, that has the aspects of both, on the one hand, idolatry. Now, idol worship also has an aesthetic aspect, that is, beautiful idols or statues which are sculpted. So they provide some aesthetic satisfaction, and because of that, Stephen is attracted towards Roman Catholicism for its aesthetic aspect, its patronizing of the arts, but he is repelled by its regimentation, too much discipline and too much formality, too many formalities and so on. So that repels him. So Stephen has kind of love and hate relationship with Roman Catholicism. Then he comes back and he is in the kitchen. So this moment of we may say redemptive confession, which is an abstract experience, spiritual experience, which is more or less, which gives us an idea of what was happening in Stephen's psyche. This is alternated with the imagery of food. So as I told you that in this novel, the images of sexuality, they are alternated by images of food, and the confession includes the image of erotic satisfaction, and therefore after this confession of erotic satisfaction, we find that images of food take their place. The green square of paper pinned round the lamp cast down a tender shade. On the dresser was a plate of sausages and white pudding, and on the shelf there were eggs. They would be for the breakfast in the morning, after the communion in the college chapel. White pudding and eggs and sausages and cups of tea. How simple and beautiful was life after all, and life lay all before him. Now, this breakfast is rather a simple or ordinary English breakfast or Irish breakfast. Egg, sausage, pudding and tea. So life seems to be simple. So we come to the simplification of life. Stephen comes down from this very complex spiritual experience to some kind of very simple experience of life, like taking breakfast or having breakfast. Hello, are you there? Make some noise.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes.
Do you have any questions?
No, sir.
No questions. Okay. So we go on to the next chapter. The next chapter is the opposite of what we found in this chapter. So if in this chapter the crisis about sexuality is resolved through a confession, the next chapter is an opposite reaction by Stephen, and he becomes more and more spiritual. He becomes extremely religious-minded, and he assigns every day to some religious thought. So the chapter begins, Sunday was dedicated to the mystery of the Holy Trinity, Monday to the Holy Ghost, Tuesday to the guardian angels, Wednesday to Saint Joseph, Thursday to the most blessed sacrament of the altar, Friday to the suffering Jesus, Saturday to the Blessed Virgin Mary. So every day is dedicated to the thought, to some religious thought. So this regimentation is prepared by none other than Stephen himself, because now he wants to, go an extra mile to be redeemed from his earlier sinfulness. Every morning he hallowed himself anew in the presence of some holy image or mystery. His day began with an heroic offering of its every moment of thought or action for the intentions of the sovereign pontiff and with an early mass. Every part of his day, divided by what he regarded now as the duties of his station in life, circled about its own center of spiritual energy. So notice that he thinks that in his station in life, that is where he has reached in his life right now, he has some duties, spiritual duties. So this idea is just the opposite of the idea that Stephen would express later, non serviam. That is, I will not do any duty. So when his mother would request him to do Easter duty, he would say, I will not do it, echoing Lucifer's non serviam. But that comes later. Right now, he is eager to perform all these duties. His life seemed to have drawn near to eternity. Every thought, word and deed, every instance of consciousness could be made to revibrate radiantly in heaven. And at times his sense of such immediate repercussion was so lively that he seemed to feel his soul in devotion, pressing like fingers the keyboard of a great cash register, and to see the amount of his purchase start forth immediately in heaven, not as a number, but as a frail column of incense or as a slender flower. Now this is both humorous as well as thoughtful, artistic. And here I suppose that there is also a kind of satirical dig at the Roman Catholic notion that you can purchase your worth in heaven by doing something, either by doing penance or by doing charity to others or by building something. You can purchase some merit in heaven. In our religion also we sometimes have this notion. Rich people make great donations to help the poor, or they would build or they would offer water to pilgrims, drinking water, or they would offer shelter for pilgrims, devotees and so on, or dharamshalas. The idea is that by doing these things, the builder or the rich man who has donated would purchase some merit in heaven. So Stephen or Joyce here ridicules this idea by imagining that it is like a cash register. So only the thing that you are having is not cash but some merit, and if plenty of such merits accumulate, then you can go to heaven. So here is both humor and also I suppose some sarcasm, and the thing that Stephen does not exactly imagine that his merit will come out as a number in heaven, but he imagines it to be expressed through either a trail of smoke coming from incense by burning some incense, or as a slender flower. Why? Because these are aesthetic expressions. The incense burning and producing a trail of smoke, it satisfies the olfactory sense. So it is sensuous, aesthetic. And the tender flower satisfies our sense of vision, smell and touch. So these are aesthetic expressions. So that reminds us that in spite of trying to be very religious, Stephen retains his qualities as an artist. That is, he still thinks of everything in aesthetic terms.